The Brown Pundits Browncast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the fifth episode in our series of podcasts on the history of Indian subcontinent. My name is Manish Taneja. In this episode, we will cover the period from about 650 BC to 250 BC. This is just after the end of the Vedic age and the Indus Valley civilization, and we'll cover the period till the end of the Mauryan Empire. The speakers for the episode are Mukunda, Raghavan and Gaurav, Lele. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
What's up?
Hi, Manish.
Hi. Right. Gentlemen, it's 650 BC roundabouts, or perhaps 700 BC. Take our listeners through the political map of the subcontinent. Let's start with the northwest and move all the way up to east and south. Mukunda, what's happening in the northwest, which is present day Pakistan, bordering Afghanistan, all the way to Indian Punjab?
I think there was a couple things going on at this time. I think this was during the rise of the Mahajanapadas. In this period, the Vedic age had just recently ended. There was some shifting of dynamics happening at this time. I think during this period, we have some information again, but not that much in terms of material cultures. We do have quite a bit of textual evidence. But again, this textual evidence becomes difficult to parse through because some of it is very quote unquote mythological, right? If you consider like various, it's a long period, 400. If you go to the earlier part, like 650 period, that's, you saw some older Upanishads and you have older texts of that nature. But this is also roughly around the time where the Buddha's about to come up, right? So in this period of time, you have a lot of different, what we would call, in modern parlance, some sort of republic type kingdoms. The Mahajanapadas, quite a bit of them are republic type kingdoms in which basically there was a confederacy of kings or royalty in some sense that would vote on a singular ruler in particular way. It was very akin to, I would say, Greek democracy at the time, meaning that only a certain group of individuals were able to vote. Pretty much all men, and also from a certain community, whether it was landowners in the Greek sense, or in this sense, it would really have to be individuals of maybe Kshatriya background, maybe some other backgrounds. We get a hint of that in Mahabharata, again, when you refer to Krishna's people, the Shauryas and the Vrishnis. They tend to be part of a confederacy connected to the larger Andakas, I believe was the name. And they were basically like Ugrasena, their king was voted in as king at the time. And they talk about that briefly. So I think what it is this period in history is this really transition period from a very strong, well, not strong, but like Indian kingship was never strong. It's always been a weak central kingship. But it was a shift from a transition, I would say, from more of the Sangha or the Sangh, or Sangh here I mean by like a confederacy, into a monarchy, right? Because if you look at even Vedic chiefdoms, I believe quite historically speaking, they tended to function much more in a republic type setting. But there was a transition from, I would say, 650 down to roughly the time of Mauryas, that it became more of like a kingdom per se, where it was no longer like representative or republican. It was really a birth title that passed on quite strongly. And so this was also the period where we see the rise, of the Shramana systems that came, whether it's the Jinnas or Jainas, and then the Bodhas, right? The Bodhas had predecessors with the Jivikas and a couple other traditions. But these were all roughly around, say, 600, 700, anyway, the period from 700 to probably 650, 600, 550 BC, in which you see this rise of this group of religions or philosophies that arose. And this is where, like, a scholar like Bronquist he makes his argument that arose roughly in what we now call the Magadha, or back then the Magadha region, where Patna and Bihar, that area would be east of the Ganga Yamuna valley there. Sorry, I was talking about Gaurav.
Yeah. So yeah, about this period. So as Mukunda mentioned, so this period, I think before 600 BCE, we had a time where the Vedic sources talk about Janapadas, so which are small kingdoms, small oligarchies, small houses, so to speak, which cover the entire region. So we talked about that in the previous episode. We talked about the Kurus, the Panchalas. So particularly about your question, Manish, if we start from modern day Afghanistan and go right way to Kolkata, Bengal, we would typically cross 12 or 13 of these Mahajanapadas, as we call them. So they go from Gandhara and Kamboja. So Kamboja corresponds to Afghanistan, Gandhara more to the Islamabad region in Pakistan. Then we go to then we come to Kuru, Panchala, Shurasena, Matsya, Vatsa, Koshala, which is Ayodhya, so on and so forth. So we start from northwest, we cross the Indus River systems, we come on to the Kuru Panchala region, which is the start of the Yamuna Ganga system. And then most of the kingdoms are along the bank of the Ganga. So on both sides of Ganga, we have kingdoms. So apart from that, we also have some kingdoms around in the central Indian region, which are Chedi, Avanti, Ashmaka. So Ashmaka is the southernmost, I think. It corresponds to the Godavari region in Maharashtra. So that is the geography of these Mahajanapada, so large kingdoms. So apart from that, there are some smaller kingdoms which are not given the title of Mahajanapada, like Kalinga, Madra, Trigarda. So these come in the epics. They have quite important role to play in the epics. But from the historical record, like, so the sources of these kingdoms, the historical records are, we have basically three kinds of sources: the Buddha sources, Brahmanical sources, and Jaina sources. So most of the Mahajanapada information comes from the Buddha sources. So that is about them. So as we must, you might have noticed.
Yeah, but the Buddha sources, Gaurav, are relatively late, right? They're not in the time period.
Yes, they are not contemporary. Yeah.
So they're like 200-300 years after the Buddha himself.
After the Buddha, right?
Yeah.
But they give they cover the Mahajanapadas more than the Jaina or even the Brahmanical sources.
Sure.
So they are.
So what we are saying.
Yeah, Manish.
So what we are saying is, at the end of the Vedic period, the geographical spread from what is present-day Afghanistan all the way to Calcutta is a confederacy of republics or Mahajanapadas. We know broadly there are.
Yeah. Not all would be republics. Some would have some would be proto-monarchies, some would be oligarchies, republics. So a mix and match of both.
Yeah, I mean, in this period of time, I think, like, again, we have different information. Some of the Vedic texts it seemed to indicate, at the end of the Vedic period and into this period during we can call it the Mahajanapada period. There was still a mix strongly of what appeared to be the republics or oligarchies, if you want to call it that, and a strong mix of also like pure monarchies, right? This was a period of flux in which I think there was a lot of different permutations and combinations going around. Now we have like our own vision of what happened, but I don't know if our vision captures how dynamic that time period must have been.
Yeah.
But we do know there were some republics, which is to say the rulers or the government was elected. Whether it was elected in the way we understand it in the present day understanding of elections and democracy, that's a different issue. But there were geographical spreads which were ruled by an elite which was elected by citizens. So we do have evidence of these kind of
citizens.
I wouldn't call them citizens. The concept of citizens probably wasn't the same as the Greek concept. I don't know if last time, and sorry, I didn't hear the episode. If you guys talked about the Parishad, then the Sabhas.
No, we did not.
Sama, Samitis.
No, we did not.
Okay. So the Vedic system in that period, a little before, right? So it was there's indications in the Vedic corpus that the kingdoms, even of the Vedic kings, had some strong republic kind of representative elements to it. There are passages in various in Vedic texts that indicate, for example, the Sabha would pick the king. The Parishad was, so there's like three different layers. There's the Parishad, there's a Samiti, and then there's like the Sabha, and then there's the Ganas, and all these terms have technical meanings. And to be honest, it's been probably like 15 years since I read the political breakdown and stuff. I believe like people like R. S. Sharma, and a few other people wrote about this tradition back in the 50s, 60s when they were writing. And I don't think there's been any real progress made on how much knowledge of the political structure of these kingdoms and these people were. So a lot of this is honestly like guesswork. But there is indication that even the Vedic kingdoms from back in the day were very much had, if not some level of representativeness to it. There was some strong representative ideas built into whether it's going to be decision making by the king, who becomes king, even in many senses where it was about election, right? So I think sometimes we get caught up in putting different cultures into the box of Western categories in some sense, when these categories might have some overlap, but they're probably very different ideas that present at the time, right? Sorry, but I should have prepared a little bit more about the Parishad than the Sabhas and Samitis, so I could talk about them, but it's been a very long time since I read it. There is a corpus of text around it, but yes, in this period is when you start seeing the shift from a more, and I would say a more democratic style, republic style, and the Mahajanapathas start becoming more and more, familial, meaning like even the Buddha's tradition, we see Buddha's own father was a king, right? And part of it wasn't just a Kshatriya, it wasn't like a regular Kshatriya, but was a Kshatriya of a kingship, and he expected his son to take over. So there might have been a more transition towards, in this period, what's that word here? Familial understanding of what a rulership is, as opposed to like elected or something of that nature.
Representative, yeah.
Yeah, representative.
Yeah.
Right. So we are saying it was, so across these Mahajanpathas, there was a combination of monarchy, whereas dynasties and monarchies, some form of representative government, and a combination of both. Would that be a fair submission?
Yeah.
All right.
Right.
So how do we know about this period? What are the sources we refer to? What is the evidence that we have when we are talking about this period ranging from 650, 700 BC to about 250 BC?
Mukunda, you want to go or should I?
Oh, the sources?
Yes.
Like you mean like our text, right? So obviously, I mean, not obviously, but this is where we get a little, not contentious, but I mean, there's overlap here, right? Some of the mid to late Upanishads will be fall under here. Although it depends on how you date the Upanishads. Some people would place like the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads and Mandukya and even Chandogya Upanishads roughly in this period of time. Some people date it earlier, like 9th or 10th century. But so we have a sense in this period. So you don't yet have any Buddha sources until roughly about 300 BCE, right around there. The Jinna sources are probably a little contemporary to that. And there was like a third system of Jivika, and there was maybe a few more systems that existed at the time, which texts aren't extant anymore. So honestly, the primary sources for the period of roughly say 650 to say maybe 350 or even 400 were Brahminical sources, right? I think there were some inscriptions found in various locations, but it didn't provide that much information. We did know, and this is only in the Gangetic Plain. So I know recently there was a few discoveries down in the south, roughly in this time period. I would say probably 5th or 6th century, in the Tamil Nadu region, where it does indicate like a pretty robust kingdom or village or town that was had clear links to the north, but we don't know how much. And this is also the period we have to remember is we have some evidence in material culture from trade, where we have more evidence from trade. We start seeing stuff come in from the Greeks, from the Persians, from even the early Romans, right? This is at the tail end of our period we're talking about. So say if you say 250, 200 BC, you start seeing more stuff from the Romans at the time. But this is not the Roman Empire we know, because the Roman Empire didn't come about until like 200 years after that. But we do have information primarily from Brahminical sources, some information in this period of later, mid to late period. What I mean by mid to late is say roughly 400 to say 250. We start seeing other sources from outside of India, including the Greeks wrote quite a bit in this period, because that's when Alexander the Great came, roughly 325 in the region. And so we do have more external evidence at that time from other sources. So I would say the primary sources, we, like, for example, we even have information we know from Patanjali, because not Patanjali, sorry. Maybe Patanjali, more so Panini, right? Panini's Astadhyayi is considered roughly written in the range of, some say, between 2nd century BCE to like 6th century BCE. So that puts us in this category of range. Even the much of the text, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, are considered to either have been, by some scholars, I have a different perspective on this because I think it's a unitary text and probably earlier, but that's another thing. Some scholars would say that these texts were written roughly around 4th century, maybe 5th century BC to, like 2nd or 3rd century CE, right? So they take the perspective of a longer period of time, which we can discuss that. So we do have mostly Brahminical sources, and then the early Buddhist sources coming in, around 300 BCE, which is, the Pali canon, and then the Jaina sources. And honestly, I haven't read too much of the early Jaina stuff, the Jain stuff, so I can't say I know that much about that much from there. I know the history of the Jains, but I don't know this primary sources as well.
Sure. Gaurav, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a slightly different take. So the Brahminical sources we date to this period roughly, that is true. But especially, I don't know why, but in academia, more emphasis is laid on the Buddhist sources. which are more, how to speak, like the worldview of some of the Brahmanical text. Maybe Mukunda can add some light to that. The worldview of the Brahmanical authors and Buddhist authors was slightly different. So there is the understanding that we can glean more out of the Buddhist sources than the Brahmanical sources. Am I right, Mukunda?
I mean, they tend to use that. I mean, I would say they tend to. Well, it's also different because I think the Buddhist sources this time are really focused on. When you talk about the actual Polyglot and you're talking about the early conversations, the suttas between, basically they're captured, right, the conversation of Buddha and the king, or Buddha and one of his disciples. So it was much more of a discourse than it was elaborate storytelling. There did come that for sure. We know with the Jataka tales and stuff, that things of that nature. But there were, some people would say it was a little more quote unquote secular, in the sense of it focused more on categories of philosophy than it did on categories of what you would call purely religion or mythology. But there was some of that there. But the historians also tend to have difficulty. I mean, so the Brahmanical, or the I use the Hindu text. I prefer that, but the Hindu texts tend to be much more all over the place. They wrote a lot of different things, right? About a lot of different ideas, and like, for example, like, we know that some of the Puranas were extant at that time. We don't know which ones, because over time there was a lot added to it and a lot taken out of them. So it's difficult to place these particular texts in a particular time period to say, well, this is talking about this time period, right? So that is one of the issues with the texts of the Hindus. They tend to be compendiums more so than singular texts for the most part. Now, there are a lot of different types of text written too, right? Whether you think about, like, Panini writing at this period of time, or we have pieces of information from Panini about earlier grammarians like Yaska. We have other scholars at this time. Some people would place the Samkhya Karikas in this period roughly. Again, it's a philosophical text, doesn't really talk about much about the time and place. Until the Arthashastra, we don't really have a purely political text. We have texts related to certain ideas and issues, or concepts they were trying to discuss. Like, even if you look at what's it called? Sutras, the syllable sutras, right? The ones that talk about how to create a proper Agnihotra or Agnichayana, or various different types of
Rauta Sutras and Griya Sutras.
Yeah, so the things, all these ones, so actually it's good that you pointed this out, because, for example, there are some early texts like Apastamba Griya Sutra, which is dated, they date that roughly between, again, these are big ranges, so it's always difficult, like, say, the 2nd century BCE to maybe like the 4th or 5th century, maybe even 6th century BCE. So it covers a long period of time. They don't know when the text was written. It was somewhere in that period of time. So it does describe, the Apastamba Griya Sutra is different from the other Dharmashastra traditions of later, like Manu and so on, because these early Dharma Sutras, which I think we only have 4 right now left, tended to be written much more from not what should be the case, but what might have been the case at that time. They weren't as descriptive as prescriptive. There was some prescription there, but there was a lot of description going on too. And it was really someone's opinion about what society should be along with what society is, right? So, for example, like Apastamba would talk about, one of those lines was something to nature that you can learn from any source, including women, including Shudras, where later on, you were prevented for some communities from doing that, right? So Apastama had some liberal positions on it in terms of what society should be like, how it was. So we do have a variety of different sources, but they tend to really focus on the Buddhist sources because I think for the West, they saw Buddhism as being like a more honest assessment of their world because, again, maybe this goes back to what Vishwadluri and Joydeep Bagshi's position was, is that Buddhism was this pure religion that was focused on the material world and people. And I like for a long time, like people's idea of Buddhism was, oh, this was a reformed tradition within the Hindu against the the Mimamsas or the Brahmins who were all ritualistic and so on. But I think the more you actually read these texts and take those blinders off, you get a very different perspective that they were just Buddhism really I started roughly for the purpose because they were just disenfranchised with the world and wanted to escape it. But maybe I digressed here. So
Yeah. So one thing we didn't cover till now was we also have quite a lot of archaeological record from this period. So the northern black polished ware sites are associated with the Mahajanpada period. So they are found right from Afghanistan till the Magadha or Bengal region. So that is one aspect. Also another interesting thing which makes an appearance in this period are punch-marked coins. So there has not been a lot of research on this in the Indian context, but it's generally assumed in the world that coinage first began as a system of currency per se in the Aegean region by the Greeks or the Anatolians or maybe even the Persians. But there is enough evidence to doubt, to claim that coins also began sort of independently in India, because Panini's Ashtadhyayi mentions something called as a karshapan, which seems to be something like coins, and the dating of this archaeological record is not very firm, but there seems to be some evidence of coinage found in the 6th 7th BCE layer, from especially in the Kausambi Koshala region, Magadha region, and even in the Gandhara region. So that is one improvement, like not improvement, but an addition to the earlier things. So yeah, coins began.
Right. So between the archaeological evidence and the literature that we have from that period, we get to know about what's happening in the subcontinent in the period that we are discussing. Just for the understanding of our listeners, some of these very popular names, let's put them in the present day geography. So when we talk of Gandhara and we talk of a city called Takshashila, where are they located in the present geography of the Indian subcontinent?
they're in Pakistan.
Pakistan.
So Gandhara is northwest Pakistan.
Islamabad region, like
yeah.
North Punjab and Islamabad region.
Yeah.
Even parts of Kashmir.
Yeah. And Takshashila is a little bit more west of that, if I'm correct.
Right. Yeah. Right. So present day Pakistan and Magadh, I mean, everybody is
Bihar.
Yes. So Magadh is Bihar.
Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, right. Parts eastern.
I wouldn't say modern Madhya Pradesh. Maybe the Jharkhand region.
Maybe the Jharkhand area and what's also called the Chota Nagpur plateau.
Yeah, Chota Nagpur plateau. Yeah,
that's right.
That's Magadh.
Yeah.
And Gaurav, you mentioned a kingdom called Kaushambi.
Kausambi was a city.
Yeah.
City.
Yeah. Kausambi is a city. Yeah, city in the northern, northern. Yeah.
It's in Magadha region.
Bihar. No, it's, but in the Mahajanpada part, it is not in the Magadha per se. It's, I think, in Kausambi or Malla, one of those two. Let me just.
Kausambi is part of the. I mean, I would say is the region of Magadha, because that's where quite a bit of this the new movements of Buddhism, Jainism, and
the The
Gross.
one thing we have to bear in mind is Magadha Mahajanpada began in a small region in Bihar.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
as Magadha rose, as like we'll come to that later, as Bimbisara and Ajatashatru expanded, the whole like the even Koshala was part of Magadha in later times. And by the time
Sure.
of Mahapadmadanda, it went like quite some time, right? Quite some places.
Right. And so, which are the kingdoms in what would be present day India's area of Punjab, Rajasthan, Haryana, Western UP? That's the Kuru Panchal region.
Yeah. So Kuru Panchal is the Delhi region, Delhi Meerut region. So Kosambi was the capital of Vatsa, which is on, yeah, Kosambi was the
That's
capital
Eastern
of,
UP. That's Eastern UP and Bihar.
yeah. That's Eastern UP.
Great,
And
great. Now, who? And no,
yes,
please
Manish.
complete. Go on, go on.
No, so some things, so there were some few more important ones. So Avanti is the Madhya Pradesh region. Ujjain and
Okay.
Gwalior, those regions. So Chedi also corresponds to similar regions. So Anga, I think the name Bengal also comes from the Mahajanpada name Anga, if I am not mistaken.
Sure.
And then the Vriji and the Malla, which are proto-republics per se, they correspond to the North Bihar or Nepal region.
Sure, sure. Okay. Now, so who are the political players in these kingdoms? So, which is the most, what do we know about the most powerful dynasty that ruled Gandhara region? Who were the kings? What do we know about them? Then we'll come to some of
So
the other prominent republics and kingdoms.
Gandhara, we don't have much evidence. So from the Mahajanpadas, the Avanti Mahajanpad, Koshala, and Magadha are the sort of the main players, along with Vriji, maybe even Vatsa. So in the last episode, we talked about how Kuru Panchala region was seen as the dominant player of the Vedic period. So it is assumed that by the late Vedic period, the center of gravity shifted into Koshala, which is also the capital of like Ram from Ramayana. So Ayodhya falls in Koshala. So by the time this era began, the ruler of Koshala, who we know as Prasenajit, he was a powerful ruler, and apparently that was the biggest player on the scene before Magadha under Bimbisara started making inroads. So Bimbisara married the daughter of Prasenajit, who was
And
called
which century
Koshala
are we,
Devi.
sorry, Gaurav, which century are we talking of now? So,
Sixth
when is
century. Yeah, 6th century. So Prasenajit, Bimbisara, Mahavira, Buddha, they are contemporaries to each other.
Right. Okay.
So
And
yeah, so Bimbisara was a small chieftain of the Mahajanpada Magadh, and under him Magadh actually became the Magadh which we understand today as. So he through conquest, through marriage, through many things, Bimbisara made Magadh what it was. So as I talked about, he also married into the Vriji republics, which are to the east of Magadh, northeast of Magadh. He also married into Kosala, and if I'm not mistaken, he also married into Gandharan or Madra princess. So he sort of put Magadha on the central stage.
what dates do we give to his reign?
Around about 550 BC onwards. So again, there are some issues with dating these things. So Ashoka, like, so how the dating is done. So one of Ashokan edicts actually, I think, mentions that this edict is after like 230 or 240 years after Buddha left his body. So that's where we go to like when Buddha passed away. So that date comes around 480 or so. So Buddha passed away when the son of Bimbisara, Ajatashatru, he was the ruler of Magadha. So we go back like then the Puranas say Bimbisara ruled for 56 years. So we get around like somewhere in the 6th century. That's all we can be certain about.
Right. So we are now at around 550 BC, and Bimbisara is building this kingdom called Magadh.
Yeah.
Who are the other? Who are his rivals? Who are the other large kingdom in the subcontinent when Magad is coming up?
So the kingdom of Avanti seems to have had a lot of clout. There are some fascinating tales about Avanti also in the Puranas, or also in the the Buddha sources. So Avanti is one big player. As I said already, Koshala, Malla seems to be a big player, and also the Brahmanical sources as well as the Buddhist sources held up the republics in the east, the eastern republics in particularly high value. So that seems to be one thing which is also, I think, uh, what sources talk about early Roman Republic, because they did not like these kingdoms are said to be powerful because there was a sense of ownership, because they were oligarchical or representative, so to speak. So the eastern kingdoms in Vriji, one of the famous clans from them is called Lichavi. Lichavi and other clans from Vriji. They are the strong players around Magadha. So Koshala in the north, Avanti, Chedi in the east, and Vriji to their no Avanti, Chedi to the west, and Vriji to the northeast.
Right. And what is this dynasty known as?
Haryanka.
Bimbisara
So Bimbisara's dynasty is known as Haryanka dynasty.
Haryanka dynasty. Right. Right. And so, what's the society like? Has the Varna system comprehensively made an appearance?
Yeah, I mean that's tough, right? Because
Hmm.
it does seem to be some sort of Varna going on, but how strict it was is very difficult to ascertain at this point because the sources don't seem to indicate much about it, right? You know, like Bodhayana, I mean, Bodhayana's, no, sorry, not Bodhayana. Apastamba indicates some rules around this, and that there was a structure. But again, he's writing from maybe a particular perspective of his perspective at a time and a place where he thought that it should be like. Now, the question we end up having is, even in the Buddhist text, right, in this time period, the Pali Canon, obviously there's mentions of Kshatriya, Brahmana, Vaishyas, and Shudras, and there is demarcation between them. What you don't see entirely is a sort of exclusion of these groups from each other. Now, I think where you do see is, for example, the preferences coming up, or a sense of superiority. Like, for example, the Buddhist texts, when they talk about, who can be the next next Buddha or whatever, or even a Bodhisattva at that point. It's usually said to come from only Brahmana and Kshatriya communities. So like the Buddhism that most people hear about nowadays tends to be like, well, Buddhism is this reformed tradition that was against Varna and was against rituals and was about like rationalism and whatever, right? The early sources don't tend to show that. They tend to show that the Buddhists at that time, during the Pali Canon, they did not like the rigidity of the Brahmins, but they were very much in awe of their erudition and of their general like way of living. Gaurav, do you have a point on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you actually.
Yeah.
So we mustn't so there is a tendency to, because of some political changes in the contemporary times, to look at Buddhism and Jainism as counter religions. So as Protestantism was against Catholic hierarchy, so to speak. So that is not a correct way, because so that is missing the point in my opinion as well. But one distinction between these two traditions seems to be that the lot of metaphysics in the Brahmanical traditions seems to revolve around Varna, Whereas for Buddhist and Jainas, it is like it is there. They don't reject it, but they less I mean I could say less emphasis on Varna than Hindu traditions tend to do. You agree, Mukunda?
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree because so here's a couple things, right? Again, we have to put into context that Buddhism and Jainism initially in their early stages, and this also goes for Jivika tradition, it wasn't a grahastha tradition. It wasn't meant for
Exactly.
society on the whole. It was really about a particular group of ascetics and how these ascetics engaged with the world in their view. So we have to remember that in this period of time when Buddhism did arise, along with Jainism is a little different, but Buddhism particularly, this period, people would still at home practice Vedic rites, and they would live their lives in a quote unquote Vedic Hindu kind of way, but they would show patronage or align with they would align with the Buddhists on things of the nature of the self, the nature of asceticism. They go to talks and lectures or discourses by the Buddha and the early Buddhists. So it wasn't, and they would patronize them, right? They would give money so that the sangha can maintain itself and continue. So it wasn't like there was this bifurcation of society. It was much more like this intertwined multiple identity society that lived and engaged with each other in a much more holistic way than we would think about it. Like, especially when you think about it in the context of Catholicism versus Protestantism or whatever. So those analogies in your head, I think we've got to throw away, and we have to really focus that this was much more integrated community.
Right, sure. Right. And what was their economy like? Do we have any kind of trade?
So this is actually very interesting because I think this is the period of time where what you start seeing is the transition from village town life into a city kind of life. Urbanization, it just is starting to basically explode in this time period. All across the region, right? Industrialization starting to really, really take off. Industrialization, I don't mean modern industrialization. I mean just the idea of industrialization, the idea of creating industries around certain items or certain products and for export or for import, whatever. Not for import, but for general society. You start seeing, this is also the period of time where you actually start having because of the growth of industry and the growth of cities and large towns, you start to see the new ideas of taxation really start creeping in, right? In these texts at this point, the role of the king starts to take a much more powerful, prominent idea and what their duties of the king are. So the Buddhists and the Hindus, to a lesser extent the Jains, start developing theories of kingship in this period of time that are very, very interesting because they're shifting from a much more, probably a much more communal way of engaging to centralization of power. Because now you're not just a community or a large community or a large tribe and large people, you are now having to engage with multiple communities that don't necessarily have the same traditions or the same history and values and outlooks as you do. So now the idea of kingship makes much more, it has to become much more universal. And I think you start seeing that in this period of time.
Yeah, we also see the rise of merchant guilds and artisan guilds. So they were apparently a big thing. So I talked about coinage earlier. So some scholars seem to think that the earliest coinage was minted by these merchant guilds or these artisan guilds, and not by rulers per se, who acted as like these guilds, large guilds, who acted as banks and sort of had a parallel system of governance, so to speak. They had mercenaries. They had a lot of political clout as well. But yeah, so that is one.
Yeah, and the texts talk very, very much about this, right? They talk
Yeah,
about the power of the merchant class. I mean, roughly, I mean, I guess we'd have to equate them to Vaishyas, right? The word Vaishya comes from the root Vish, which means people, the people or group, So the Vish or these, were people that brought in, the Vaishyas were people that brought in the economy, that were much larger landowners. And what you start seeing with this community is kings, and this is why historically the Indian state was not as powerful as people wanted to make it out to be. The kings had to have a delicate dance with the guilds and the merchants, right? A lot of these sanghas and the Buddhist traditions, later on the temples and these public works we have were funded not by the king necessarily, but mostly by these guilds, these communities of merchants that felt they had an obligation at some level, and probably some level of pride in building these kind of things.
Right. What we are saying is there was a currency in circulation which was not backed by the sovereign promise. It was basically a currency backed by word or the economic strength of the merchant guilds.
Well, yes and no, right? Because
that may have been in some cases,
yeah,
and in some cases there are clearly like Mahajanpada coins. So some coins are clearly have a association with some king or some political elites at least.
Sure.
Yes, that's right.
And you also mentioned, Mukunda, the transition to urban centers. So which are the earliest cities that you know of from this period? Which was the first, let's say, the New York or the Bombay of its time?
I mean, so that's, again, like, because these Janapadas and these regions are very, very distinct in some sense. There were multiple ones, right? There was like, Takshashila was a proper
learning,
but it was a proper city too, right? There was an economy built around it. In the regions, in the Gandhar region, I forget what city it was, that became a very powerful merchant area where you would have Cambodia, the regions of Cambodia, and I forget what city it was, where it's like
So Cambodia traded, like they were the source of horses.
Well, not only horses, right? Like they were the route in which a lot of the Central Asian and even some Greek stuff came through, right? Persian Greek stuff came through that region. So there was a big, I forget the name of the city. I'm sorry.
I'm also forgetting.
I can look it up. Yeah.
Apart from that, we talked about Ahichatra, which was the Panchala capital. So we have Ahichatra, then we have Shravasti, Varanasi, Kausambi, Ujjaini, Mathura. Patliputra came in later. Earlier, it was the capital of Magadha was Rajagriha. So, which is also a wonderful excavated city, and people can visit it actually. So, the Vulture Peak, where Buddha seems to have given a lot of sermons, a lot of regions where Mahavira also is said to have spent some time. So, that is a good place to visit, Rajagriha. And then of course Patliputra came up later under Ajatashatru, but these were the larger cities, so to speak.
So from Takshashila all the way to modern day Patna via Mathura, Ayodhya, Varanasi, Ujjain.
Yeah.
So if somebody were to travel the length and breadth of this in this time, these are some of the cities they would cross.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things which you might have noticed by now is none of these centers are where the earlier Indus Valley centers were. So the Indus Valley centers typically we talked about were on the banks of Indus and Saraswati region. So Takshashila is not on the not exactly on the Indus. So that is the only city from that region of renown. The center has clearly shifted to the Yamuna Ganga system.
Also, none of these cities have.
Yeah. So there was a city in Tamrapatni or something like that in the Anga region, Anga or Kalinga, if I'm not mistaken. That was a big city. There are a lot of copper things found there. So it's called Tamrapatni or Tamrapali. Like I don't exactly remember, but that is one city which was there. But a lot
Right.
of these cities are based on Ganga. So they may have
Yes.
had so waterways.
Right. Right.
So one
So
thing
when
which
to.
I wanted to talk about when you talked about society was uh, currently actually these days it's very common. You can see it on social media, and also some scholars seem to say that Megasthenes, who was a Greek ambassador to the Mauryan era, he apparently said that slavery doesn't exist in ancient India, but that is not like that is far away from the truth. So we have lot of references to slaves, be they as dasa dasis in the Vedic literature or in the itihasats. Even some people are called some brahmanas are called dasi putras, garbhadasi putras. Also, there is a particular reference to a type of dasas called as dasa kammakaras or dasa kammikaras in the Buddhist sources, which I think it's pretty safe to assume that they were bonded slaves for farms. So
Yeah.
dasa
So
kammikara,
so here's the thing, Gaurav. I mean, I tend to think, for example, so I, when we say the word slave, generally there are different types, right? There are slaves like just use the Greek concept of helots, right? The
yeah.
who are born in part of a community, they're always a slave, and they can't be anything more. There's like racial slavery that occurred in America, whatever. So the slavery in India, as we call it, it didn't seem to be hereditary slavery, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, it did seem to be debt slavery,
Yes.
from as far as we can tell.
War
So
slavery, war slaves, and
yeah,
even
yeah,
that.
yeah, but even the war slaves were released. So the question that we end up having is, this was a form, in some sense, of, and it wasn't a practice that was prevalent everywhere. By the way, it seems to be not as important as it maybe was in like the Roman and the Greek world at the time, because and there's some argument to say that some people would argue that it was because there was an entire class of people like the Shudras who
Yeah.
played the role of the service industry, so you didn't need to necessarily have the slavery industry, and that some people did have it because of issues of bond, like inability to pay debts, and they would go into slavery to pay off the debt, and things of that nature. But I think it's a much more complex topic than simply saying there were slaves. There's a different type of slaves, and we don't know to what extent that actually was prevalent, and how these functioned. We have some sense, but not that much.
Yeah, that is fine. But I tend to I wanted to make this point because even what slavery is understood in the Greco-Roman context is drastically different from the transatlantic slavery or the slavery in the Islamic world, where slaves rose to become sultans. So slave word has different connotations according to the context, but they were not servants. They were something more than servants. So I just wanted to make the point that using that particular quote from Megasthenes to say that there was no slavery of any kind in ancient India is far from the truth. So how that slavery was and how it was different from other slavery, so to speak, that's a different point. Yeah.
Sure. We'll keep it at that. Now, moving on. When does Prince Siddharth stroke Buddha make an appearance? What years are we talking? And what's his backstory?
So even by the time of the end of the Vedic period, the concept of Shramanas or asceticism was there actually. So it is not that these traditions sprung out of nowhere. So like even when I was reading the Mahabharata, uh, one who performs austerities, one who one who seeks. So these kind of adjectives are used a lot of time. So there were clearly some traditions where people were mostly men who left their house and they wandered around and they sought the truth. They were disenfranchised with the world and they wanted answers. So there were many such traditions going around. So of them, the most popular today is without doubt the Buddhist tradition. So Siddhartha Gautama was a Shakya, which was a smallish republic in modern day Bihar or modern day Nepal, and he seems to have been disenfranchised with the life, and we all know his story. So he went seeking the truth. He seems to have come into Rajagriha, and so the Buddhist tales point out how he met the king Bimbisara over there. There are a lot of tales actually of Bimbisara, Mahavira, Buddha. So that is where under the rule of Bimbisara is where Buddha makes an appearance, as does Mahavira. So one thing about Mahavira is the Jaina tradition is pretty clear that Mahavira did not start Jainism, unlike the Buddha. So Mahavira, according to the Jaina tradition, was the 24th Tirthankar. So according to tradition, there were 23 before him. So historically speaking, I think 23rd Tirthankara is assumed to be true. We don't know whether, like, historically we cannot ascertain whether the 22 ones before him were real historical figures. But the canon makes it pretty clear that Jainism is closely associated with the Ishvakus, who are the Suryavamshi dynasty, so to speak, unlike the Chandravamshi dynasties which were there. So there seems to be a Ishvaku link with the Jainism, and Mahavira was just the latest of the Tirthankaras. We don't know 24, but he seems to be building on something which was already there and already widespread.
So what are the dates to put them in modern calendar? What are the dates?
550 BCE, yeah, 550 BCE to 500 BCE.
This is for Gautam Buddha.
Gautam Buddha as well as Mahavira. So Mahavira, Gautam Buddha, the founder of Ajivikism, Makhali, Ghosala, they were all contemporaries. So, and they were contemporaries with King Prasenajit and Bimbisara as per the sources.
Yeah, Mahavira is a little bit older, right? He's probably like 40, 50, maybe half a century before Buddha. I mean, there are some later tales, Buddha, Mahavira meeting, but that's probably not ever happened.
Yeah.
Right.
But
and
there seems to be some overlap between Mahavira and Bimbisara. And
Yes.
maybe Bimbisara and later Buddha. Like Bimbisara comes into Buddha's story when Buddha was very young.
And when
Buddha
Bimbisara was very old.
Bimbisara was very old, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And we are talking, the geography that we are talking is present day UP and Bihar in India, Bihar, Jharkhand, Eastern UP, when we are talking
Nepal.
of these contemporaries. And Nepal, when we are talking of these contemporaries.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. So, how is it that here is a civilization that's firmly rooted in a Vedic tradition? What makes these movements or religions popular in an age amongst people who've been practicing Vedic religion for centuries?
Yeah. So this is where it gets kind of like interesting in some sense. Is again, like, part of this is people didn't have an identity as we think about it today. Like, no one's like, well, I'm Hindu, I'm not, and I'm Buddhist, and whatever. These were all like a mesh. People pick and choose what they wanted to do at what time. Like the underlying society fundamentally, whether you're Buddhist, Jain, or Hindu, was fundamentally the same. It didn't shift when you had a Buddhist king. What would occur was simply the patronage would shift, right? And maybe more Buddhist stupas and sanghas were given funds to go forward, or when the Hindus were there, was maybe more temples or more brahmanas get lands and so on. So, but it didn't fundamentally shift. So the everyday lives of people were roughly the same. So the question is like, there is strong evidence that the Buddhist community didn't actually get that big purely as Buddhism, right? As we see when we get to later periods, when Buddhism leaves China, leaves to China and other parts of the world. It was, I wouldn't say they were necessarily competing even, because you do see, even in this early period, and much more attested later periods of Buddhism and Hinduism, that a lot of the Hindu and Buddhist scholars would train with each other and learn from each other their systems and take things from each other. So what I'm saying is the question itself, I think, is difficult to answer, just because we don't have a sense of what was going on the ground, like if people were suddenly becoming Buddhists and giving up everything in their Vedic sense, like, what you see here in a conversion situation, whether you're converting from Hindu to Muslim, Hindu to Christian, you don't see that back then. What you see is the only time it was a drastic change is when you went into the Sangha, right? Then you have a whole different set of rules. And even for the Jainas, when you become a Jaina bhikshu, that's when you have different rules. But for the most part, people's day-to-day lives was exactly the same as it was before the advent of these traditions. It's almost as if these traditions were, the way I think about this is, so because of the nature of much of the Upanishads and stuff, like the Upanishad movement, the Buddhist movement, and Jain movement were somewhat similar. The difference, what I would say, is the Upanishad movement, because it's already part of the larger Vedic Hindu world, it just kind of went under the current and came in through the Hindu world in their rituals and their practices and the way they view the world. The Buddhist tradition and the Jain tradition were separate. They didn't really, it's not like they referred to the Vedas, or most of them don't even care about the Vedas. It was there. And once in a while, you might see, in the early Pali Canon, Buddha say, what I'm saying is no different from what the original Vedas were saying, whatever. So there is sometimes lip service paid to it. But it was a different alternative for when individuals wanted to break out of the cycle of samsara. So that's all I would say would be the big difference.
Yeah. So the Jainas and the Buddhas, they assumed certain level of facts. So they assumed there was rebirth. They assumed there was karma. They assumed moksha. So these were we can say that they
and
were
the gods too. The gods, devas, are all.
Yeah. Indra. So even today, if you go to so there is a cave near me called Bhaja Cave. So it is a Buddhist cave, and on them you can see Surya, Indra, on Airavat. So all those things are there. So there is a lot of overlap, so to speak. And one thing which was different about, we already touched upon that. So Mukunda already mentioned it, how these traditions were more for the Sangha or for the monks, so to speak, and not per se for the lay worshipper. The Jaina tradition makes a distinction between monks and lay worshippers. So one way to look at it is, especially the Jaina and the Ajivika traditions, they are pretty hardcore. So kind of stuff they expect the followers to do, especially the monks to do, it is even difficult reading it. Some of the things which the way they are supposed to leave their body, fasting, not even consuming water. So there are also tales of Ajivika saints and monks expected to sleep on bed of arrows and lot of things. So they are also expected to pluck out their hair so they would not kill lice. And like we all know many things about Jainism today. So they one way to look at it was these Shramana traditions. Their entire focus was slightly different from the Vedic traditions, even though they were acting in the same atmosphere or in the same air. Their emphasis was on karma and moksha. So that was their whole worldview, so to speak. So their aim was to kind of have good karma or kind of be without any karma so that they can attain moksha. So they differed. So Jaina and Ajivika also differed between each other. Like there are some differences between them, lot of philosophical differences. I would not like to go into that, but they had slightly different worldviews. So the Ajivika worldview is more deterministic without free will, and Jaina worldview has some free will, and you have bad karma, you have good karma. And what Buddha essentially did was he took a middle path between these the Vedic traditions at one end, the hedonistic Charvaka and materialistic traditions, which were also part of these traditions on other, and the extreme Shramana, Jaina and Buddhist traditions. So Buddha's teachings are called as the middle path. So he would, like, for example, if you take the question of meat. So Buddhist monks are allowed to eat meat, but they are not allowed to kill an animal for meat. So they can consume meat if it is given to them by someone. So that is the way I would like to see it. So
Sure. So what we are saying is both the Jain tradition as well as the Buddhist traditions were not very drastically different from Vedic traditions. They were just versions they picked up from the Vedic traditions, built on them, and then sort of brought them their own.
metaphysically and philosophically, they were drastically different. But how, like, we should not see it from the lens of the lay people as following this religion and that religion. So they are not religions per se. They are metaphysical activities pertaining to attainment of moksha. And
Sure. So we didn't see any religious strife per se when Buddhism or Jainism came up, like we see in the later ages in the Middle East when the Abrahamic religions come in. There wasn't any major religious strife when a new set of ideas and new set of religious thoughts started to emerge from the shadows or against Vedic age.
I think there was, I'm sure there was
there was
intellectual
strife.
strife. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was intellectual strife, and there was probably some like some churn going on there, but it wasn't, from what we could tell, it never was a physical strife, because most people didn't give a rat's ass about this, right? Like, okay, our king has converted to Buddha. His dad was, a Surya worshiper. So what? Nothing's really changed. Now, obviously, there might be one or two cases through the history in which things were drastically changed, but that was more the exception than the rule.
Sure. So moving on now. So now we know Ajatashatru has built this city called Patliputra, which is arguably one of the largest urban centers in the subcontinent at that time. What happens next? Who is he succeeded by? What are the political formations that take over from his dynasty?
Well, it's also funny, right? Isn't it funny how he took power, right? He killed his dad or imprisoned his dad, and his name, but funny, Ajatashatru means he who has no enemies yet to be born, right? So it's just, he was this like power hungry dude that basically imprisoned his dad to take the kingdom. But yes, just a tip.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, his son, who is called Udayin, he actually moved the capital from Rajagriha to Patliputra. Ajatashatru didn't. Ajatashatru built Patliputra as a launching pad against the Vrijis. So when Ajatashatru got power, he started expanding Magadha, and one of the targets was the republics to his east and northeast. So to attack them, he built Patliputra, which was on the banks, this bank of Ganga, to attack on that bank of Ganga. And then his son Udayin, he shifted the capital from Rajagriha to Patliputra because the empire had, like, the center of empire needs to be there. And
Sure,
the
but
funny thing is,
let me
yeah,
pull
the
you
funny,
back. Let me pull you back.
yeah,
Let's first talk about Ajat Shatru. This is an interesting trivia that you guys just shared.
yeah,
So he is this ambitious young prince who imprisons his father.
imprisons
What's
or
their
kills.
story?
Yeah. So the Jain and the Buddhist sources contradict each other as they do with Bimbisara. Actually, the funny thing is, Bimbisara is claimed as a Buddhist by Buddhist sources and claimed as a Jaina by
That's right.
Jaina sources. And so we will maybe touch upon that later. I have some thoughts about that, but that may be a digression here. So Ajatashatru killed or imprisoned his father. That is pretty sure. Like he seems to have regretted it. And there is another interesting trivia associated with that. So Buddha's son-in-law or Buddha's brother-in-law, who gets a bad rep in the Buddhist literature, he seems to have, I'm forgetting his name. So he seems to have colluded with Ajatashatru to kill, imprison his father. So that is also, and then Ajatashatru came back to his senses, and then he went to Buddha and atoned for his sins. But again, his son seems to have done the same thing. And then the Puranic sources say that 9 kings after that did the same thing, like they killed their father to ascend to the throne.
That's some palace intrigue, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So the famous movie, actually, if you know, Manish, Amrapali, Life of
Yeah,
Ajatashatru. Yeah.
yeah. But Amrapali is a much later tradition, right? That's
Yeah.
doesn't come from the Pali period. It comes from probably the first century BC, if not a little after that.
Yeah. And it's,
I
yeah.
somehow I always thought Amrapali's story was Bindusar, Ashoka's father, and not Bindusar, but one learns.
Yeah. Yeah. Those two names are pretty confusing. Bimbisara and
No,
Bindusara.
I'll also come up with an urban legend regarding Bindusara when we come to him. So now we are talking of Ajat Shatru. So this is a so who follows this dynasty? So what's happening now? So
So, so then after Ajatashatru, there was, like I said, there was Udayin, and then after 4 or 5 generations, uh, the it the sources say that the people of Patliputra got fed up of this palace intrigue, and another dynasty comes up, which is called Shishupala or Shishunaga dynasty, something like that. So that is the next dynasty, and that rules for around 100 years or so. One of the kings of that dynasty is called Kala Ashoka king, and he seems to have been killed by a barber or a Dasi Putra, so to speak, as someone from low birth, and he apparently usurped the throne. So this chap is known as Mahapadma Nanda, who the founder of Nanda dynasty,
so now
which
which
was like
century are we talking of? What are the dates are we talking of when
yeah, fourth century, fourth
fourth
century
century,
BC. Yeah,
4th century BC when the Nanda dynasty starts?
yeah,
And the center of this dynasty and the center of the subcontinent has now
Patliputra.
comprehensively moved to Patliputra and Magadh.
Yes,
They are the most powerful kingdoms in the subcontinent at this time.
yeah. So Mahapadmananda, like Mahapadmananda seems to be the first. Let me just check it up.
Let me just also say, it wasn't necessarily the most powerful because we haven't even talked about like the Pandyas in the south.
Yeah, but geographically, at least we can say Magadha was the largest player. So there were 3 kingdoms down south, right? Chera, Pandya,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
Chola. So they would have had the peninsular India, like the southern tip. But Magadha seems to have ruled from at least from Delhi till Bihar. So yeah, that is Mahapadmananda for you. And he was apparently from a lower birth. He is also compared with the, like in some of the sources, he's compared with the uh, he's called the annihilator of Kshatriyas or something like that with Parshuram, but that story of Mahapadmananda rings of that of Parshuram story from the Puranas. Like, I don't know where the story comes from. Mukunda can correct me, but that rings.
So before we move forward, so all this is happening north of Vindhyas. What's happening south of Vindhyas?
Well,
So, yeah,
yeah,
Mukunda,
I
go ahead.
mean, we have some evidence, right? So the south of India is interestingly, so the earliest textual evidence we have is the Sangam literature, right? And the period, the Sangam literature is basically like broken into three periods by scholars. One is what they would call like the head Sangam or Tala Sangam, and then there's middle Sangam and late Sangam. In this period of time, you have what the compilation or the beginning of books called Agam and Puram. Agam deals with inner stuff like love, and Puram deals with war. So, I mean, these are just broad categories. And in this period is when you start having basically the first indications um, of our understanding of Tamil. This is all Tamil method, but this is Sangam Tamil, which is very different from modern Tamil. We start having a very clear picture of what the southern world was like. We don't have a whole lot of information, but we do know that, for example, even during this period of Sangam, at this point, the Vedic tradition had already been seeped in pretty deeply in the Tamil people at this time. They talk about various deities like Shivan and Mayan, who is another name for Vishnu, and Skanda, and a few other people. So we know they did have brahmanas down there. They talk about that. The Sangam period, is very rich, but the difficulty again is also sometimes is demarcating what of the literature belongs to what period. So down in the south, like Gaurav indicated, there was three major kingdoms, which is Pandya, Chora, Chela, and then there was a few other smaller kingdoms we mentioned, and these kingdoms were generally always contested with each other for power in that region. But the Pandya kingdom it seems to be the one that had the longest period of time. I think there were for almost 1,000 years they were in power, and they're referred to even in the Mahabharata and the texts in the north. Whether it's Mahabharata or Ramayana or a few other texts, they talk about the Pandya kingdoms. Do you have anything to add to that, Gaurav? I don't want to talk for a while.
Yeah, so a few things we know about that is like the Pandyan kingdom seems to be famous for pearls. So the record of it that being like it's on the tip of the southern tip, and a lot of pearls were like exported or traded by the southern kingdom. So other two kingdoms which we have from south are the Chera and the Cholas. So they find mention in Ashokan edicts as well, and the Sangam period. But as Mukunda said, like before, like for our period, 500 400 BCE, we are not quite sure what happened down there.
Sure. So coming back to the Nandas in Patliputra and Magadh, what's happening there? How's that kingdom expanding? What's the driver of its economy? What's their society like? What is the religion that dominates the people and the king? What do we know about them?
The Nandas seem to be patrons of Jainism. So they are, at least we cannot be sure because both Buddhist and Jains claim, but there is more evidence in favor of the Jains, I would argue. So there would be some patronage of Jainism, and that other things. I mean, I don't think a lot of things would have changed after Nandas coming to power. As per the records, as per the Greek records, the Nanda kingdom had like a huge army and like something around 1,000 or 2,000 elephants, 10,000 chariots, lot of cavalry, lot of infantry. So it was a pretty big kingdom.
And what's the geography of this kingdom? It starts in the east from what's present-day Bihar, going all the way up to west. Where in west?
Yes, till Punjab, yeah, almost Punjab. We are not quite sure whether they went beyond Punjab, but at least till the Delhi, Haryana region, we can say the Nanda dynasty had some sway.
And what's driving their economy? How are they able to afford this kind of standing army? What are the trades that the
I
population indulges in?
I think one of the most like important things to understand, like maybe appreciate, is the Gangetic Plain supported, like has traditionally supported a lot of people, and the river systems, Ganga Yamuna river systems, uh, are very pro agriculture. And I think the most strong thing for going for these Gangetic kingdoms would be human capital before anything else. So they had a lot of people. So some of the text say about Kalinga, which is modern day Orissa, that it was apparently the most crowded region. So that is one part of the story. Second thing seems to be all the major cities were based on rivers. So that there would have been a lot of trade going down on these regions. Iron seems to have become a big deal. So as we transition from bronze to iron age, agriculture would have flourished a lot because of iron utensils. Lot of unarable land previously would have been arable because of iron. So that is one part. And as we talked about the trade guilds, I think they continued into the Nanda period, and they would have been also responsible. Uh, One unique thing about India, so there is a story of the king of Vatsa and Avanti, I think. About I think the king of Vatsa was able to tame elephants, had a skill for taming elephants or something along those lines. So elephant course seem to be playing a lot of role in the army as well. So that is also one thing where these kingdoms, because they had a lot of elephants, the Gangetic plains, they could dominate in warfare and so become big.
So it's the fertile basins of the Ganga and the Yamuna River, plus technological advances that are helping the Nanda dynasty build on uh, and expand its area of influence.
Yeah, and the Nandas are seen in the Brahminical sources at least, or even the Jaina or Buddhist sources, as being very what do we call, very very money hungry. So they seem to be like there is a story of Nanda horde, a Nanda horde which fell in Ganga, and I think some people are still looking for it. A large horde which had a lot of gold, a lot of silver. But again, we don't know whether it is true or not. But at least there are myths associated with Nanda dynasty that they were very rich.
Sure, sure. So my introduction to the Nanda dynasty was through a television serial called Chanakya. It
Yeah,
it aired in India in the early 90s, 1990s, and I distinctly remember Dhananand
Dhanananda.
as the king.
Yeah.
So, who's this Dhananand? What do we know about him? How is the evolution of the Nanda dynasty reached its point that Dhananand is now on the throne and
I think he's the
all the interesting stuff?
son of the Mahapadmananda. So sources say nine sons. So there were total nine Nanda kings, Mahapadmananda and his eight sons. So Dhanananda might be the last of them. So he was the, yeah, he seems
So
to be the
he's
one. Yeah, yeah, go on, Manish.
so he is the ruler when we first hear of the founder of the Mauryan Empire, Chandragupta Maurya.
Yeah, and
Right.
also when Alexander comes, so he is told that there is a large king to the east, large kingdom to the east, and like that's where we get those large numbers. So I think Dhanananda or the one before, the later Nanda kings would have been ruling the Nanda dynasty.
Right. So who's on the western flank of Indian subcontinent? Who's the king who finally takes Alexander head on? He never reaches Magadh. He never crosses the Indus River. So who are the people who are ruling that part of the country?
So there are actually two. So there is Gandhara, and we are not quite sure which region. So when we talk about Gandhara, it is a larger geographical region. So there seems to have been a king in Takshashila and one Paurava Raja, which is famously known as Porus from the Greek sources. So apparently the Takshashila king made like joined hand with Alexander to fight the Paurava Raja, and that is the famous Battle of Hydapsis or Battle of Jhelum, where the Paurava Raja was defeated, but Alexander was so impressed by him that he gave his kingdom back. And then that is where actually the story comes in, where he met a young Chandragupta who was urging him to invade Dhanananda. But that is again not a very firm story. But what we can say is Alexander, instead of going east, crossing the Indus River systems, he went down the Indus and invaded some republics, proto republics, which were there in the Sindh region. And there are many violent stories from Alexander's conquest over there. So we seem to think, like in popular culture, that Alexander stopped at Porus and then went away. So he didn't go away. He went down the Indus, and he at least had, like, there are at least two or three reports of large scale wars in some of those republics which Alexander fought before going back.
Sure. So we come back to Magadh. So the Nanda Empire's coming to an end, and there is an upstart called Chandragupta Maurya who's making an appearance. What do we know about him?
So yeah, there are a lot of theories. Exactly know what his background was. So some theories say he was illegitimate son of the Nandas itself. Some say they were a Kshatriya clan who had lost power in earlier times. So we are not quite sure. He at least claims to have been a Kshatriya, and he seems to have been supported by a Brahmana named Chanakya. And there are a lot of stories about how they tried conquering Magadh, failed, then did again. So many of those tales are from very later records. So we can't say which of them are true and which are not. But what we can confidently say that he conquered Magadh at some point, and started the Mauryan Empire.
Do we have any archaeological evidence to back any of these claims? What kind of evidence do we have? What is the source of our information on the Mauryan Empire?
So we don't have much archaeological record for these things. So one of the things, these jigsaw puzzles are fixed together by 3 or 4 strong dating points, and based on those sheet anchors of Indian history, lot of comparative, those are taken as reference, and then the narrative is built around them. So one of the sheet anchor is Chandragupta meeting Alexander. That is taken as one sheet anchor. Then we have Ashoka, who had his edicts.
Yeah, but the funny thing is, Chandragupta probably never met Alexander.
Yeah. So that was one of the earliest, Presnip, or what's his name, that British Indologist who was working on it.
Yeah, that's right.
So
I forget his name.
Yeah, and Sir William Jones seems to have. So Greek sources talk about Sandracotus, and I think Sir William Jones put it as Chandragupta from the Mauryan Empire. But when we come to Ashoka, the dating is that is where the dating becomes robust. So Ashoka, who was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, about him we know a lot of things. So from multiple sources. So we actually don't know much about Chandragupta Maurya from contemporary sources.
So what do we do? Do we then, in our understanding, do we directly then move over from Chandragupta Maurya to Ashoka, or do we know anything about Bindusar?
We know, one of the popular stories about Bindusar is that how Bindusar was like so Chandragupta Maurya, when he became, so this is the popular narrative. It is not very firm, indulge. So when he became king, he became very paranoid, or maybe that was because of the paranoid advisor he had, who we know as Chanakya. So Chanakya apparently started poisoning Chandragupta Maurya a tiny bit every day, and then his wife ate his food, and then she went into a miscarriage, and Chanakya broke open the belly of the dying pregnant woman and saved Bindusara. So that is the popular story for birth of Bindusar.
And incidentally, that's also sort of an urban legend or a myth that that's the first recorded caesarean birth.
Yeah, yeah.
So Bindusara apparently is the first recorded caesarean birth. But I don't have any source to sort of attribute that to. It's just one of those things I heard when I was growing up. Sorry, carry on. So Chandragupta Maurya. So what is the geographical spread of this empire? Where has Chandragupta Maurya taken Magadh to? What are the boundaries of his empire now?
I think during Chandragupta Maurya's time, Magadh was firmly till Takshashila at least. So Gandhara region was under Magadh. So from Gandhara till the heartland of Magadh, that would be the region.
Right. So he's succeeded by Bindusara. What do we know about Bindusara?
So Bindusara, one thing we know, that is again, this also comes from later sources, is he was a patron of Ajivika faith. So he was the follower of that faith, which seems to have been lost in later times.
Just before we get into Bindusara, it's important. The traditions also indicate what we have is Chandragupta. He passed his life away using the Jain practice. He became Jain.
Yeah.
And the claim is he went down to South India, somewhere near Karnataka, and there he basically fasted until death.
Yes.
In the Jain tradition. So.
Yeah. But even that comes from a very later source.
Yes, that's right.
If I'm not mistaken. So again, we cannot I don't think like many of these Buddhist and Jain sources, they try to appropriate many rulers. So they also contradict.
But according to this, Gaurav, I mean, this is why Indian history is always, at least until even parts of Ashoka it's just a hodgepodge. Like it's all from later sources. And people pick and choose their narratives they think are more real than not. We don't really have much about Chandragupta at all. Like, there's entirely possible he didn't exist, at least not the way we think he did. So it's just, it's, I mean, Ashoka, when we get to Ashoka, we'll talk about the edicts. That's pretty much the only way we know he existed. But yes, go ahead.
We run into these problems. But we can that Jain story seems to be I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that story. So there seems to be that connection. But even when we come to Chanakya, who is in popular imagination, we think of as a Brahmin, a pragmatic Brahmin, so to speak. Even the Jaina tradition claims him. So he is in Jaina tradition, he is a Jain Brahmin. So again, that actually goes to your earlier question, Manish. So you could be a Jain Brahmin. So there is no contradiction in that term, a Buddhist Brahmin, a Jain Brahmin. So these people
all this is getting pretty complex, and it's far away from the simplistic narrative that at least I grew up reading in school textbooks. That Chandragupta Maurya was succeeded by Bindusara, Bindusara was succeeded by Ashoka. Ashoka took the Magadh Empire all the way down south. He even sent his ambassadors to Sri Lanka. And but if we're really not sure what is the source of our information from this era, I think how do we go about it then?
I think this we can be pretty sure that it's fair to assume that Chandragupta Maurya existed. He conquered Magadh. His son was son or his successor was called Bindusara, and from whom then we go to Ashoka and what was
I mean, I was being a little facetious about saying, he might not have existed. There's reasonable probability he did. I mean, it's just too many sources from two different places have some facts that just seem to align. And then from whatever epigraphical evidence we have from the time of Ashoka seems to also touch upon it. So I was being a little facetious because it is, I mean, look, the evidence is scant. And the deeper you go back into history before writing, before the way we chronicle history today, it becomes more and more difficult to establish, at least on any scientific or historical footing, such things occurred the way we say they occurred. So, I mean, we can talk probabilistically, I think, at best.
Yeah. So especially compared to Western history, like if we go to the Greco-Roman world or Mesopotamia or even Chinese history, the the writing, the historical writing in those cultures was pretty prolific. So we had a lot more information. Whereas in Indian context, I think the writing or the texts are more philosophical, or they have other concerns. Their politics is not their primary concern. So am I right, Mukunda?
I mean, I say yes and no. I mean, I think there is a catalog, for example. I mean,
Puranic, yeah.
the Puranic catalogs of kings, but they're not, to be honest, unless the king did something exemplary, they're not really giving a crap about recording what they did. They'll just record the name for the purpose of posterity,
Yeah.
and then assign some random number. Like, actually, they don't even give you how long each king ruled. They just give you a number of years. And then everyone has to figure out afterwards. So
sure.
Yeah.
So I'll pull you guys back to a fascinating figure, and quoted so often, compared with Sun Tzu, and the most talked about figure in specific circles, and generally a very influential figure in India, which is Chanakya. What do we know about this gentleman? What do we know about his origins? What was his contribution?
Yeah, that's also another contested thing, right?
Yeah.
There's Chanakya versus Kautilya versus
Who was
Vishnugupta, right? Like each of these people are apparent. Either some people think they're all the same person, right? Because the person in the Arthashastra is Kautilya, but Chanakya is the person referred to in
Chandragupta.
Chandragupta. So people either say they're the same person, they're two different people. I don't know where I stand on this. I tend to think maybe there's some germane of truth here. I don't know how much, but the text itself, like the Arthashastra, is pretty awesome. It's because it's one of the first secular texts that we have, quote unquote secular. And I use quote unquote. I hate the word secular anyway, but I'm just saying it because it doesn't refer to any sort of religious practice or mythological aspect. Again, I'm not using mythology as in it's not real. I'm just saying it's not history as we understand it. The text itself is pretty comprehensive for a king on how they should think about ruling their kingdom in many ways.
Yeah. And about the Chanakya, who was the guide or minister of Chandragupta. So we know that he probably was from the Takshashila or Gandhara region, that we can be pretty sure about. And then he, again, these are tales and we do not know whether they are true or not. But he seems to have been dealt improperly by the Nanda king, and he had some, so the stories go that he had some personal beef against the Nanda kings. So that is why he sort of did his machinations to put
He made a
Chandragupta.
vow that he would not tie his top knot, his
Yeah.
shika, until the Nanda king was killed. And so then the story goes he was kind of in distress because he was not able to find someone to fulfill his goal. And then he once saw this young boy playing with his clay army. And he saw within this young boy was young Chandragupta, and who had these skills of leadership and ability to strategize. So he decided to take him under his wing and then train him and raise him to be his, so to speak, sword of justice.
So all this is in the realms of speculation, right? But what we do know is there is a text called Arthashastra.
Yeah. So
Which has-
even Chanakya, like, so that's the thing is, again, like Chandragupta, there's very little information about. Chanakya, outside of the Arthashastra, even less information about.
No, so again,
yeah.
so Chanakya, the Buddhist and Jaina source talk about Chanakya, who was the guide of Chandragupta.
Yeah, but that was much later, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like a contemporary source where we can say, oh yeah, everyone knew him. It's a later text where some of these traditions were talked about and held and passed on, and then everyone claims them. So yes, so
some of these tales are as old as like 12th century CE as well.
Yeah.
So old as in they're very old.
Like most people know him through his the play.
That's a play.
Yeah.
Mudra Rakshasa.
Yeah.
That's a Gupta era play. Yeah.
That's right. Which is about probably 1,000 years
500.
after. Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe 500, 600 years after the actual Chanakya existed.
But many of these things have a kernel of truth at their like origin. So we just cannot say how much. Yeah. Sure. How much of that is true.
Sure. I mean, now coming to the first great king of, arguably in some circles, the first great king of the subcontinent, which is Ashoka. So what do we know about Ashoka?
So he seems to have been not the crown prince of Bindusara. The crown prince was called Sushima, and Ashoka was apparently about his earlier life, about Ashoka we know a lot because the Buddhist sources in particularly talk about a lot of Ashoka in very detail, but they are also later sources.
Yeah.
So we know that he was the governor of Ujjain, and he was not the crown prince. And then there was a civil war between Ashoka and Sushima, in which Ashoka finally prevailed. And the texts also say that he killed a lot of his brothers on his way to power. And the Buddhists especially paint the earlier Ashoka in a very negative light. So because obviously they want to juxtapose it against the reformed Ashoka because of Buddhism. So but about Ashoka we know a lot, unlike earlier rulers. So he seems to have.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we could probably do an entire podcast just on Ashoka. And
so let's try and do that. Let's start with dates. What do we know about this date? Which year was he born in? What do we know about that?
So, like 300 BC seems to be the plus minus 20 would be a good date for birth of Ashoka.
It can't be plus 20 because we know 323 BC is when 325, 326 BC is when Alexander was here. So it can't be then because that's what we were just talking. That's when Chandragupta is around, and if Chandragupta is a
it was probably after 300 BC.
No, sorry. Yeah. I 200. Yeah, closer to
No, I mean his rule was roughly from 268 to 232 or something, right?
Yeah.
So if you give or take, his birth. Again, we don't have the exact birth date, but we can comfortably say it was before. It was after 300 BC.
Yeah.
Right. So and he takes over. So what dates do we have when he takes over as the king of the Mauryan Empire?
So 270, I think 260, 270 around that time.
And then he expands the kingdom. He goes down south, takes over more kingdoms, takes the kingdom to the west.
Yeah, I mean the decisive moment is what they say the Kalinga battle, right? They placed that around 260 BCE. Now this is a very highly contentious position about whether he was Buddhist before this or after this, or if he converted in any real way, or there's just a lot, because honestly there was a lot of myth making that occurred in
modern India
about who Ashoka was, where the sources are not as confident on any of this.
So the Ashoka Vandana, which is a Sri Lankan Buddhist text, so that paints a different picture than some of the Indian or even the Chinese accounts. So we don't know, like he conquered Kalinga. He seems to have had some contemplative thoughts after that. But one of the fascinating things is the he still had some realpolitik sense. He seemed to be thinking that Ashoka was a pacifist or like turned pacifist or so on and so forth. But the edict which is closest to Kalinga, that doesn't mention his regret about Kalinga. The edicts in Takshashila in Gandhara, they seem to emphasize that how he regrets what happened in Kalinga, so on and so forth. The edict near Kalinga doesn't talk. And I think the Kalinga edict or some other edict also, where he's talking about how a king should be just and should not be violent. In the same edict, he's also juxtaposing how the forest tribes should be in line, and if they go out of line, he will like crush them, and he's warning them. So he was definitely a very complex figure, and like especially in India, we do not have anyone who like before 2000 years who wrote like who had these many things to say. So there are four types of edicts from Ashoka: the major, minor rock edict, then pillar edicts, and a lot of text is there where actually Ashoka or Priyadarshi or Devanam Priya are like is what he calls himself. So
But
we
it's
have actually a
actually,
lot.
but this is
Yeah.
actually where it gets interesting because there's no, this is not Indian scholars, so but there's a growing trend among some Western scholars that are now saying Ashoka is different from
Priyadarshi.
Priyadarshi or Devanampriya, right? So I think it's a very interesting idea because what the major rock edicts only refer to Priyadarshi or Piyadasi or Deva Priya, right? Forget.
Devanam Priya. Priyadarshi and like
Devanam
beloved
Priya.
of the gods. Yeah,
Yeah,
Devanam Priya.
Devanam. So yeah, it's Devanam
Devanam.
of the gods.
Devanam.
Yeah. So Devanam Priya. So Devanam Priya, and they're distinguishing the two because only the minor edicts refer to Ashoka, and
Yes.
all the major edicts are all in Devanam Priya, right? So they're the modern. There's a lot of discussion now that they might be two different people, and Devanam Priya was actually the son of Chandra of Bindusara, and yeah.
I think we are messing up a lot of people's understanding of history.
We're just
And
trying to
I
be
am the
honest.
and I am one of them. I am one of them. I had a very simplistic understanding of this. He followed him, and this is where we are.
Yeah,
But
so the person to read for that is Christopher Beckwith. He's a professor, I believe. I can look it up real quick. Bloomington, Indiana. Yeah, so he writes about this, and this is his big position. So and I think the book is the Silk Road, early Buddhism in the Silk Road or something like that. I forget. Yeah.
Sure. Now, when Ashoka is going all around, what's happening in the northwest? We do have records of the governors that Alexander left behind.
Oh yeah.
And so, what's the equation like between those guys and the Mauryan Empire, and how is that dynamic unfolding?
So Bindusara or Chandragupta seem to have married into some of the daughters of the Greeks. So that we can be like there are some. I think there are Greek sources which back that up. So that we know. Apart from that, I think there seems like Ashoka at least seems to have had quite a bit of sway in the Indo-Greek world in the northwest, because some of his edicts are also interestingly written in Aramaic, which seems to be the legacy of the Persian Empire. So in Persian Empire, I think one of the languages was Aramaic. So some of the edicts are written in Aramaic. One edict, I think, is in Aramaic, and then the Kharoshthi script. So a lot of interesting overplays over there in the northwestern part. So one thing actually we assume is that because he was able to have these edicts from Karnataka right up till Gandhara region, he was sovereign over that. I think that is misleading. We cannot be sure that he was sovereign of this vast region without especially fast roads and fast communication networks. But the Indian ideas of kingship were slightly different, as Mukunda also said. So the sovereign would not actually rule over everything. So there is a concept of Rajamandala, which is more relevant in the Gupta era. But we the confidence of stating that Ashoka ruled as a sovereign from Afghanistan till Karnataka, that is pretty not very firm in my opinion.
Sure.
So he had varying degrees of sovereignty. That is how I would put it.
Right. And how does it all end? What do we know about the end of Ashoka and the Mauryan Empire?
So
His
after
grandson.
Ashoka, yeah. So his grandson or his great grandsons. So the Senapati of the Mauryan Empire, he apparently during a military exercise in Patliputra or in Ujjaini killed the ruler, and the name of this Senapati is Pushyamitra Shunga, and he started the next.
Sorry. I'll Gaurav. Who are we talking of? We're talking of Ashoka. How does Ashoka die?
Okay. I thought you were talking about Mauryan Empire. So Ashoka dies I don't think there is a lot of controversy about his death.
Yeah.
So
No, I mean, all we have is stuff from the Ashoka Bandhana about this. And
yeah,
it just basically he just dies a Buddhist way. He gives his
Buddhist
stuff.
way.
Yeah, he gives his stuff away and then kind of just dies. But there's no sense of they say he got sick or something, but there's not much about it. He died a very normal death.
Yeah. One thing which we missed about, he seems to have patronaged, constructed a lot of stupas.
Yeah.
So
Right.
the Sanchi stupa, the Mahabodhi stupa, Nalanda, Takshashila stupa, lot of things.
Again, these are what they
Claim.
say. Not that he constructed himself. This is
He
him,
started
he patronaged. There's patronage, right? So again, this is where we have a lot of the history then becomes more about narrative telling, because much of this is taken from
Ashoka's own propaganda. So
either Ashoka's not his own propaganda. Part of this is his own propaganda. Part of this is from Ashoka Vandana or the Mahavamsha, and then there's the Indian sources which don't talk that much about this.
Yes, the Puranas actually don't give much space to Ashoka.
No.
Surprisingly, they talk about Chandragupta Maurya. Even the Nanda kings they talk about in more detail. Even Bimbisara Ajatashatru, Pushyamitra especially because he was a Brahmana. But Ashoka doesn't get much coverage in the Brahmanical sources. And one more thing I noticed few days ago, it is Ashoka has been portrayed as someone who was against Brahmanical rituals and against Brahmanas, so to speak.
Yeah.
But if you read actually his edicts, he everywhere, anywhere where he's talking about Shramanas, in the same sentence, it is he's using Shramana Brahmana or Brahmana Shramana.
Yeah.
So Brahmanas and Shramanas are given equal respect in his edicts. In many of the edicts, he also explicitly says that respect to Brahmana is one of the ways you follow dharma, so to speak.
And also remember, at this time, Shramana doesn't just mean Buddha. Bodhas. It means Bodhas, Jains, Ajivikas, other yogis that have left the society and become ascetics. So so a lot of this this focus on him being Buddhist is a part of the myth making that occurred from the British to the modern Indian era.
Yeah, so we cannot actually say, because even if you go through what Buddha says, what is Buddha's core messages, and then try to juxtapose it with Ashoka's message in his edicts, it is not very like it doesn't fit coherently. So
Yeah,
Ashoka's dharma is different than Buddha's dharma.
100%.
Like
I think Ashoka's dharma is more akin to what we would call like Raja dharma.
yes,
It's not the dharma of the Buddha and the ascetics. It's a
dhamma,
very
yeah. And I mean, I recently, like few months ago, I was reading through his edicts. I found some translations, and I actually wasn't able to correlate it with Buddhism per se. More like what an ideal king should be,
That's
like
right.
uh, a nanny state, so to speak. A nanny,
Yeah,
like that's the
Right.
impression we get.
that's right.
Of course, his legacy survives in modern day India, the Ashoka Chakra in our national flag. And
So Upinder Singh actually wrote a book few years ago, A Political History of India. So in that she makes like these claims that how the Indian Republic, especially Nehruvian consensus, wanted to wish a lot of things on Ashoka and Mauryan Empire because it was the only pan-India empire
Yeah,
and they wanted to like own it up. So a lot of myth making actively went into the Ashokan project. So they didn't want to own the Mughals because obviously for obvious reasons. The Gupta Empire did not span as much geographical region as the Mauryan Empire did. So
yeah. For some reason, they were just really obsessed with the idea of a single unitary India.
yeah, political India.
But even if you think about it, like even Chandragupta, I mean Ashoka, even in his largest state of his empire, he didn't make it below the Vindhyas, right? So the entire south was still left.
Yeah. Actually,
Yeah,
the Sangam literature talks about how Mauryans failed to come down south,
yeah,
and like the only two rulers from north in ancient time who could actually make an impact down was I think Kharavela from Odisha and Samudragupta,
yeah. That's
who
right.
were able to actually invade and make some changes. Ashoka's may have been more a trade sort of things.
right, right. So, what's the legacy of this period? Apart from two very popular religions, one in Indian subcontinent and one
I
pretty
mean,
much everywhere.
honestly, this is probably one of the most, aside from the political aspects of this, like in the political narrative and things of that nature. I mean, we haven't even got into honestly like the texts that were created in this period that still leave legacies to this day, right? Like for example, again, like when we talk historically, like we've talked about Mahabharata in the past, like most scholars, and I'm just using what most Western scholars say here, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree, but here's the position: is they believe roughly at this time is when like texts like the Ramayana and Mahabharata were written. So the impact of this period on later history of India is pretty phenomenal, to be honest. It might be one of the most impactful periods ever. So I mean, this is the time period again when we didn't even get into Panini. The entire world of grammar, right? The first grammarian, first linguist of the world who created a science of linguistics, developed the science right here, right? And that had for the next 500 years impacted the way Indians have thought about language, have thought about philosophy, have thought about words and what words mean and all this other stuff for all this time that later influenced people like Chomsky and how he developed generative grammar and things of that nature and computer science. So I think there's a lot of tendrils that go back to this period of time that we can't. I mean, we could do a podcast, separate one, but I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying we could, just on the amount of things that from then to this day that we can show a direct link.
Yeah. Another thing, like these devotional cults around Shiva and Vishnu, they are also dated to this time. So the Bhagavata cult arguably had older roots, like Vedic roots, but they seem to have become what they are, like in the Mathura region. That is where this Bhagavata cult seems to have developed.
Yeah, the Bhagavata Pancharatra, right? So this is where they talk about, with Heliodorus and the pillar. And then you also
Samkarshana
have
and Krishna. Yeah.
So this, it goes back to an older, the the tradition says it goes back to the Krishna Yajurveda, and it's found in the Samhitas there about the Pancharatha tradition owes its connection to the Taittiriya, Samhita, the Krishna Yajurveda. So it goes back pretty far, and then the connections develop more fully in this time period with the worship of the five Vedas, like Krishna or Vasudeva, Samkrishna, Pradyumna, Niruddha, and or either they put in Shambha at the last one, or Arjuna or Balarama, right? So not Balarama, those will be the five.
Yeah, and also something we touched upon in earlier episode, Manish, about vegetarianism. So, we talked about how there could be Hindu, like Vedic roots to vegetarianism. But I have I have done some reading on this, and I think there may have been roots, but if you take off a political perspective, like what we call about the Overton window. So we touched upon this earlier. The extremes to which the Jaina and the Ajivikas went, that seems like, in my view, shifted the Overton window on vegetarianism and Ahimsa so much to the far that everyone, like all the other sects, had to sort of go along. So
I would say more so the Jinnas, because
Yes.
they did not eat any meat. The Buddhists were still
No,
relatively...
not Buddhists, like Jainas and Ajivikas.
Ajivikas, yes, for sure, yes.
They were like Ajivika, we can think of as a subset of Jainas as well. So they sort of shifted the Overton to that extreme that even around this time we find the doe sacrifices. So earlier in the Vedic times, it's fair to assume that actually animals were sacrificed for the Vedic rites. So this is the time period where Vedic Brahmanas also shifted from animal sacrifice to doe sacrifices. And the Jainas were so against Ahimsa, they were against doe sacrifices as well.
Yeah, for our listeners, doe, he means like doe, not like a female deer.
Yeah. Flower made animal models.
That's all right.
So sacrifice of them started, which continues till this day in Vedic Hinduism. So
excellent. I think as we sort of go forward in this series, we'll continue to go back to this period, and just like the Indian subcontinent sort of still borrows from this period, our history podcast series will also borrow from this period. Any final comments? Any concluding comments, guys?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I know the few podcasts I've been on, it becomes more. I know I say a lot that we don't have much information, and I do mean that, but that's also relativistic, right? Compared to what we have now for history. So I think once we get past the Ashoka period and more closer to the modern era, not modern era, but the common era, the history and the sources and the physical evidence become much more prevalent and powerful and foundational, right? A lot of this that we talked about from the time of, say, Indus Valley, Vedic, and now this period, is a lot of it is narrative driven. There's some evidence, but it's evidence interspersed with a lot of speculation that has become fact in terms of how we accept it. Now, going forward, I think we'll see in the later periods that the evidence is stronger than the narratives.
So one thing I would like to add, I touched upon the northern polished blackware. So it is one of the things about the shaky narrative, shaky foundations. It is dated around 7th century BC to 2nd century BC. But some of the recent radiocarbon dates on the northern polished greyware, which they yielded results as 800, 900, even 1000 BCE. So there is a lot, we are not on firm foundations for this period, especially when we want to correlate archaeology with this.
Yeah, and just one more point. I do think it would behoove us to do a separate podcast on the South, particularly because we didn't cover that much. I know there's not much comparative to the North in this time period, but there is some unique stuff that we should talk about. And I have
right. We'll do that, Mukunda. As part of the upcoming episodes, our focus will move down south, and we will have specific episodes around that. That's a very good point. That's well taken. I'm convinced this whole focus of generally talking about what's happening in north of Vindhyas, and especially as we get more in the common era, what's happening around in and around Delhi. I think we should make a very conscious attempt to sort of go beyond that and
Go beyond
what's
that,
happening everywhere.
Just one thing I would like to add is if anyone wants to take up. So there is a sutta, Buddhist sutta called Sammaphala Sutta. So that is a conversation between the Magadhan Emperor Ajatashatru and Buddha. And that sutta touches upon all the 6 pre-Buddhist Shramana schools. So they are the Jaina schools, the Charvaka. Charvaka is also, I think, considered part of Shramana in that school. I'm not sure about, like, Mukunda can correct me. So that sutta gives a good idea of what the Shramana traditions were and how Buddha sort of like came to a middle path. So that is a good thing to read.
Sure, we'll put that as part of our podcast notes.
Yeah.
Right. This was great stuff, guys, and look forward to seeing you on the upcoming episodes. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Tune in next week for Brown